Let's talk about multiplication of real numbers. Hopefully, after going through this, what you'll realize is that the multiplication of real numbers is basically like any multiplication you've done before. But what you'll see is that we're going to spend a lot more time focusing on variables and negative numbers. But the rules really don't change. Here's our rules. The first rule says that the product of two real numbers with the same sign is the product of their absolute values. Basically, this is kind of the rule we always refer back to. If they're the same sign, they're positive. Positive times a positive is positive, but a negative times a negative is also positive. The second rule we have, it says the product of two real numbers with different signs is the opposite of the product of their absolute values. Well, basically, if one's positive and one's negative, your answer will be negative. And that's just a real simplified version of it. So we're going to deal with same sign and different signs. Look at this down here. It says, what is the product if you have three negative numbers? So simply, what if we had something like negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 4? Well, a negative 2 times a negative 3 would be a positive 6 times a negative 4. 6 times a negative 4, hopefully you can see, would be a negative 24. Again, 6 times 4, if you talk about this up here with their absolute values, 6 times 4 is 24. And since one's negative, our answer is negative. Okay, so three negative numbers, our product is negative. So if we had four negative numbers, simply negative 2 times negative 3 times, we'll just do negative 2 again, times negative 3. Negative 2 times negative 3 is a positive 6. Negative 2 times negative 3 is also positive 6. If we multiply those two numbers, we get a positive 36. So 4 negatives gives us a positive. And you can maybe start to think of what would happen if we multiplied 5 negative numbers. Negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 2. And this is just an example. I'm just making up these numbers, picking them out. Negative 2 times negative 3 again is positive 6. Negative 2 times negative 3 is a positive 6. And then we have our negative 2 here. 6 times 6 is 36 times our negative 2. And if you go 36 times a negative 2, we get a negative 72. So what you can see is if we have an odd number of negatives, our answer is negative. But if we have an even number of negatives, our answer is going to be positive. So that's just a little rule we probably already know, but you might see questions like that come up on tests. So let's look at some examples here. Very simply, this again isn't any different than what we've done in the past. 9 times a negative 3. Well, 9 times 3 is 27. Since one is positive and one is negative, our answer is negative. If you look at this next example here, 8 times a negative 1/2 times a negative 6. If we go 8 times a negative 1/2, you can think of it, well, what's half of 8? Well, 4 is. Positive, negative, that'd be a negative 4. And if we do a negative 4 times a negative 6, 4 times 6 is 24. Since they have the same sign, their answer is automatically positive. Again, multiplication, the rules are pretty written in stone. If they're both negative, the answer is automatically positive. Unlike adding, where we kind of have to think about how far in the number line they go down. If you look at this power here, remember what this means, and be very, very careful with these. This is different than this. Okay, notice that we're raising the negative 3 to the third power, not just 3. So what that means is that this is negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. 3 times the negative 3 is going to be a positive 9 times the negative 3 equals negative 27. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you type this into your calculator without parentheses, you will get the wrong answer because your calculator will not treat this as a negative 3. So it's really important that you put the parentheses in. Okay? One more example. Now just looking at this, can you tell whether it's going to be positive or negative? We have how many negative real numbers? 1, 2, 3, 4. If we have 4 we have an even number of negatives, we know our answer here is going to be positive. So really we don't have to worry about the negative sign. We can just say, okay, what's half of 2? 1. And 3 times 5 is 15. And, well, 1 times 15 is just 15. Okay? So again, our rules of multiplication aren't changing. We just have to be more careful with our negative numbers. Odd number of negatives, our answer is negative. An even number of negatives, and our answer is positive. A few more examples, again dealing with variables. If it helps, think of this as being negative 1's out in front. Okay? We know 2 negatives. 2 is even number, it's going to be a positive. Well, what's n times n? Or how's n times n simplified? Well, it's just simplified to n to the 2nd power. Okay? So again, we don't have to worry about being positive or, you don't have to worry is it positive or negative if you recognize that there's 2 negative numbers, even number of negatives, positive answer. Same thing here, be very careful. If it helps, put in negative 1's. But if you look at this, we have 1, 2, 3 negatives. This one doesn't have a negative sign. So I know automatically that my answer will be negative. Now, we have, if we do that first, then we can just ignore the negatives and say 4 times 1 times 1 times 1, which is just 4. And then you look at your x's, we have x times x times x, which is x to the 3rd power. Okay? Notice this next example, how it's different, because this negative is outside the parentheses. What this is saying is we're taking the opposite of b to the 3rd, or the negative of b to the 3rd. So this, again, if you want to put a 1 out there, you can. This is like saying negative b times b times b, or a negative 1 times b times b times b. Okay? So, since there is 1 negative, that's an odd number, so we know our answer is going to be negative, and well, b to the 3rd is, or b times b times b is just b to the 3rd. Okay, and again, a little tricky because it's almost the exact same thing. We can just write it without parentheses. If there's b to the 4th here, though, we know our answer would have to be positive. Again, looking at this example down here, if you compare it, this time our negative sign is inside the parentheses, and we're dealing with an even number of negative y's. This means negative y times negative y times negative y times negative y. 4 negative y's. 4 is even. Our answer is going to be positive. And if you have y times y times y times y, that's y to the 4th.